Welcome to the Safe Business Agility Podcast. This is the place to get advice, stories, perspectives, and updates about safe and related topics to help you work differently and build the future. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts.
Today's guest is Willeke. Eric is the founder of Elevate.to, an author, Safe fellow, and all-around pretty great guy. We're talking about all things Safe 6.0, flow, and a few cool things Eric has in the works. I hope you enjoy this great conversation with my friend Eric. Eric, it's good to see you, man. So we're hanging out here at the SPCT Masterclass, so this is probably a few weeks ahead of when this episode's going to drop. And we're talking about some pretty cool stuff, and I can't wait to pick your brain about it. So first off, welcome. Thank you again for being a three-peat guest on the Business Agility Podcast. Do you want to tell the people just a little bit about who you are and what you're doing these days, because it's a little bit different than what you were doing the last time?
Yeah, thanks. So Eric Willeke, a Safe fellow SPCT, previously founder of Elevate.to. And these days I'm taking a little bit of a break from the consulting game and looking a little more deeply at the knowledge and the content and how all this stuff we've been talking about forever fits together. So I'm excited. I'm not going to announce the specific writing projects, but I think there's going to be a book coming sometime in the next year that I'm excited to share later. And I'm really digging deep into some of the front end of SAFE and the relationships with the business architecture and how we take all the amazing work we've done and turn it into transformative outcomes for the enterprise.
So what I think I heard you just say is that we're going to be talking again in a year around some new writing initiative, which is pretty cool. I love diving into that stuff, and I can't wait to see what you come up with. So what we've been doing the last 2 days, just to kind of catch people up, right? So every 3 years or so, anytime there's a major revision to the framework, we bring together all of the SPCTs, the Safe Practice Consultancies from around the world to really dive deep into what's changing. And when the new version of the framework goes live on March 15th, the intent is that these people will be largely the market-facing experts to answer the questions, because there'll be a lot, right? There's a lot of clients, and we can't possibly take them all internally. So we've seen a lot of stuff. Yesterday we focused on kind of the platform of Safe Studio, and some of the cool, new job aids and things that are coming out of that. A lot more user-friendly, a lot more intuitive. And today was all about Safe 6.0. For any of you that are listening, it is Safe 6.0. Please don't make the mistakes that I've been corrected numerous times on, at any rate. So we saw a lot of new stuff. We saw the new big picture. Looks great. A lot of stuff on there. What do you think, Eric? Open-ended question.
I'm kind of excited. It simplifies and clarifies a lot of the things that weren't quite in the right place or in the right shape for making the points we needed to make in previous versions. For me, the big picture itself, I've always treated it kind of as a table of contents. Some people, I think, treat it as a blueprint or a how-to guide. For me, it's a table of contents. We're organizing this huge system of knowledge that has the opportunity to reshape how you steer and run your enterprise. And it can't be simpler than a certain level. I mean, you're a complex enterprise. So every version since I first encountered it in 0.1 has improved its organization and its ability to tell that story. And what I'm looking at now is a wonderful progression of that.
It's definitely everything that you said, right? So I think my analogy is a little bit different. You're a writer, I'm a gearhead. I always look at it as a toolbox, right? There's a lot of tools in there to do specific things and to solve specific problems. And how you use that tool, your intent with that tool dictates how it feels, right? And I think you're right. I think we've learned a lot of lessons over the years. Last night we had a social. It was kind of entertaining to walk by the progression of the big pictures over time. And, every single time one of those things was published, we thought, wow, this is great. There's so much good stuff in there. And it was at the time. Mm-hmm. And then we tested and we broke things and we learned things, and we've evolved. We've evolved with the speed of business. And one thing I always think it's kind of cool is Dean has never said, wow, this is a great version, right? He always says, pretty excited for Safe 8, which who knows when that would come at this current pace, maybe another 6 or 7 years. But you're right. I mean, there's a lot of good learnings in there. And I think the learnings in the evolution of the framework can kind of draft off of the success that the previous versions have had, right? So if you look I think it was Safe 3 maybe when DevOps was first introduced. I remember talking to clients about it. And this idea of DevOps and releasing any more frequently than once every 3 years was just a pipe dream. They couldn't imagine doing that. And if you look at that perspective, which was maybe 7 or 8 years ago to now, well, the conversation's evolved. They're not thinking that thing sounds aspirational. It's what they're doing. And now they're thinking about how do we leverage it even better?
Yeah, I mean, if you think back then, we had release management as a team sitting right next to DevOps. And thinking that way now makes me twitch a little bit.
Yeah.
Like, we don't want to separate these responsibilities. We want to take the mindset of DevOps. Remember when it was a team? But we want the mindset of DevOps to just permeate everything everybody does. It's practically a core competency.
Sure. And so let's expand that, right? So Safe 5, I feel like Safe 5 kind of landed with a thud, right? Because when it launched and we talked about business agility, super exciting. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of great energy around it. And then the pandemic happened. And I feel like there was a lot of excitement and it just kind of got washed away. But with that, I think there was great strides made to understanding what business agility is, right? It's not a capital B, a capital A. It's the mechanics of being able to respond quickly to an ever-changing world. And I think what we're looking at now is the next evolution of that. Do you want to go ahead and dive into what you mentioned is kind of your favorite topic from this latest revision?
Yeah, I mean, hands down, it's got to be flow for me. I've been a fan of Kanban and the Kanban method since the earliest conferences and conversations well over a decade ago. And it's always existed, I don't know, you might say a little uneasily alongside a lot of the iterative and Scrum-based methods. And as we look at this from a SAFe point of view, it's come together, frankly, at every level of an organization. And it'll show up in every point of the framework, each of the layers. But when I look at it from a leadership point of view, I need flow from my teams. I need flow from my team of teams. And I need flow in those big disruptive investments that I'm counting on to change my revenue profile and reshape my enterprise. And anywhere in my enterprise that I don't see flow happening, well, it's first an opportunity. I need to go fix it, but it's also what I'm going to pay attention to as a leader. If things are flowing, if people are delivering valuable content, whatever it is, software or otherwise, on a reliable basis, I don't need to pay as much attention to them. It's where I see the inconsistency, the stop-start behaviors, the lack of flow. That's what jumps up to me as a leader and says, there's something here.
So I'm with you. I hear the questions that come in, mm-hmm. right? So I grew up in a household very focused on manufacturing, and lean was part of my life. Flow was part of my life because that's how my dad operated every day. And my early consulting gigs, I could see it, right? Because I was working with manufacturing facilities. You can see it on the line. You know, you can see the cards, you can see the states of the various stations, and it makes sense. When we talk about doing knowledge work, right? There's a big difference between what you can see on a line and how you can measure it and how you can feel it versus what you're going to see and what you're going to feel in the development of intellectual property and the development of any sort of knowledge work. And I think where a lot of people are sitting right now is, wouldn't that be cool if? But wow, I have a hard time understanding what it means for me. So on a team context, and I think back to where, you know, the early days of launching Agile teams, the teams that thought Scrum was too heavyweight thought they wanted to be a Kanban team because it just sounded easier, right? And what we all learned was, well, it's actually a lot more high touch and it's a lot more disciplined. It's not easier, right? It requires a lot more. Mm-hmm. I think where teams are at now, a lot of teams are going to embrace that, right? They're there. They realize that they're moving faster than the speed of a 2-week iteration. Yep. What I wonder is, what does that look like for the rest of the pipeline?
I think we have to start in every case with the basics. You talked about how easy it was and visceral it was when something was blocked up on a manufacturing line. Step one is always create that visibility. Make it clear, make it obvious. We we know what the value is, or at least we better know what the value is for any product we're building, any outcome we're pursuing. And we'll explore that and we'll discover that through all the great UX and product management techniques. But you got to know what the product is and where you're going, and then organize around that.
Sure.
And by making that work visible, whatever it is that it takes to create it, whether it's marketing campaigns, software development, new financial products, the principles are the same in knowledge work, but that has to be visible. And then there's a mind shift, and I ran into this myself. Many of my early engagements were for software in a manufacturing context. And Lean and Six Sigma and this mindset of mass repeatability and creating flow was permeating, but it was anchored on this zero variability mindset. How can you create perfect consistency? And I think we've learned that that's not what we're looking for in knowledge work. We want flow. We want this very intense focus on value. But we don't want to try to make everything perfectly repeatable because there's no innovation there. There's no discovery. So I remember sitting at dinner with, I think it was Hal McComb, who works in lean construction, and he was lamenting the high degree of variance and variability in construction projects, sometimes as much as 1 or 2%. And I'm just sitting here thinking, software? I'm lucky on an innovative product if I come in under 100% variance if I'm early discovery phase.
Sure. And I think that manufacturing context it's an important reference, right? Because it's different. The consequences are different. I remember in the shops that my dad worked in, the things that they were building, they would have tolerances of 10 thousandths or 100 thousandths of an inch. There was no room for mistakes. And there's certain spaces where that's absolutely important, right? We're talking about medical devices. We're talking about aircraft. Those precision manufacturing processes, you can't have that variability. You need repeatability. And I think a lot of the work that we focus on, right, is about exploiting that perfection. So if you have this repeatable process, this precise machinery, well, you need to figure out consistently, how do we create software to best exploit that precision? And then once we do, well, how do we make it even better? How do we better exploit that precise method? I think where people still struggle is in transparency. I think we're still trying to measure the system of work as if it were a manufacturing line. And I think that there's some apprehension around, if we're too transparent, there's going to be too many questions and we're not going to have the ability to be creative. But with that said, we have to start somewhere, right? Those precise manufacturing lines were once really dirty and ugly plants, and it took time to evolve to where flow was something that was just what they do. And maybe we're just at the first steps of that.
I don't know. I'm struggling with playing with that because I feel like we've learned enough in software where this should be self-evident. And I think a lot of the perhaps internet native companies have understood that, and there's plenty of companies out there that will cycle multivariant experience experiments hundreds of times a day, mass parallel experimentation. And there's no room for that in a typical manufacturing line.
Sure.
Our goals are different. Our goal is to optimize the flow and creation of learning that then manifests in the form of software or products that people want to consume. And I do see constantly leadership that is carrying a belief in predictability that manifests as the say-do ratio, or manifests in perfect estimation and predictability of what you create. And I find myself concerned and actually keep a closer eye on teams that are too predictable.
Sure.
Because those are the ones that something isn't right.
They're probably not being wholly transparent.
Or they're living in an area of low psychological safety, or there's a leader lower in the organization that's creating some strange behaviors. But those are the ones I go and pay attention to.
Why do you think we behave that way?
Honestly, financial stress is probably one of the big ones. Maybe not personal financial stress. I mean, many of the people we're talking to are probably a little safer in that regard. But financial stress as an organization and that kind of sense of danger that comes from a quarterly reporting cycle and living in the corporate world, I think that drives a lot of pressure that somehow leads us to behaviors that we would never contemplate in our personal lives.
It's interesting you say that. I've been doing a lot of reading lately around some of the more modern of the traditional management theories that we work under. And if you really dive into the history, right, the roots of those things in the behaviors that made them popular are entirely counterculture to what we value today. And I think it's interesting that we can look back and see that that's true, but that we still hang on to it because that's the way we've always done it. That's what's brought us success to this point. And I wonder at what point we're going to give ourselves, it's the broader we, right? So as a species of business professionals, when are we going to give ourselves permission to let go of that stuff? What's it going to take?
I know you're looking at me across this recording studio, and I don't think there's a clear answer to that. I mean, a lot of Agilists love to talk about safety. In the SAFE framework, we start to look at flow. We're looking at the bigger picture, and I think with that will come an understanding and a belief that little jitter at the team level isn't harmful. It's if you allow the jitter and the unpredictability to cascade too far and it's hidden and not compensated for, that's when it starts to get scary. So I think the more safety and slack that we can build into the system to absorb small learning and then actually leverage that and exploit it into better outcomes, I think we'll just need enough examples of that. And the more we try to control outcomes with precision early on, the less we'll actually get the control we desire.
Yeah, I think it's going to come to an awareness of behaviors, right? Because we all have anxiety. We all bring different things to work. And I had this deep conversation a few days ago. But I think it's going to become very apparent as we try to flow, right? Because as we try to be more fluid, the different resistors in the system are going to become more apparent. And just like anything else through this whole journey to agility, right? We move faster, our pain points in the system become evident, and we have to deal with them. And I think we're to a point now where it's the individual behaviors, the individual reactions, and how our communication flows that's really going to drive our success to flow as a team, right? Because it's little things like as we try to move fast, if I make a decision or if I have an idea and you look at me with if you look at me a certain way, right? You might not mean anything by it, but it might trigger something in me that causes me to make a different decision that slows down the whole system. So I think this idea of psychological safety, we've talked about it, and I think a lot of well-intended leaders have done their best to embrace it. I think we're to a point now where the systems are going to be well-tuned from an operational perspective, and I think it's the humans that are going to be the limiting factor, right? We've always been a limiting factor, but there was so much other work to do to improve the system that we could probably not work so much on ourselves. So when I think about flow, that's kind of where my head goes. I think this is really a point in time where we have to change.
I think you're absolutely right. And perhaps, as you were saying that, one of the things that struck me is by focusing on flow, by really starting to pursue the perfection of value delivery, we are exposing new edges too. Edges between silos, edges between technology systems, all these things that as very competent leaders, we could optimize in our own space. Suddenly we can't. Our span does not include the across to the other side of this edge. And we're, as humans, being forced to work with people we've never had to work with.
Sure.
If I look at the composition of an end-to-end value stream team, the leadership team that spans an entire operational into the development value streams of a interesting domain, you're talking a dozen different disciplines and backgrounds, many of whom may not have had to collaborate closely with those other leaders in anything but the largest corporate launch events.
Sure.
And now we're asking people to do that on a day-to-day basis when our habits, our incentives, our management styles, a lot of these things just aren't aligned out of habit yet.
I think it'll be interesting to see as well as we start to force this. And it's not that we are forcing this, right? It's that the pace of business is forcing these behaviors. The way that previous management models would treat that group of peers, and I think it's important to remember they are peers. They're working for the same outcomes.
Yep.
But at that level of leadership, the system would encourage competition, right? If I want to get ahead of you, I have to beat you. Therefore, I do things that are inadvertently or sometimes intentionally detrimental. And that has a very profound impact on the system. But if we want to move fast, that's got to change, right? We have to be working as one. So I think that'll be an interesting dynamic. And if I had a great hope for this, and this is selfish and petty, so bear with me. I really hope we can get rid of the term "the business" from our vocabulary. Everybody says, I used to think it was just an IT thing, right? It was business and IT. But then I started working in other domains, and everybody calls their customer the business. And it's such a divisive term to me because we are all here for the same outcomes. And when you start using that dehumanized word that's meant to imply difficulty in communication. When I talk about the business, I hear you say, I have a hard time delivering what that entity wants, and we don't communicate well, even though we're all here to do the same thing.
I might argue with you a little bit on that one. I used to have a lot of that reaction. I used to treat the business right up there with resource, and other terms that Agilists twitch when they hear. But I started to look at it more from a profit-centric and a revenue-centric view. And I could actually see a path to recoining it as a positive focus. Where is the source of real connection to the customer and value to the enterprise? And then how does everybody else in the enterprise orient in service to that shared purpose? And if you use the concept of the business then not as an other, as a they, but if we start to rebrand it and start using it as a connection to the value and to the customer, suddenly it starts to look a lot brighter and shinier. And something that I can actually embrace is, how do we connect to the business? How do we make our technology decisions better aligned with what the business needs?
So reframing the business as our shared outcome as opposed to those people over there.
As our connection to the people we serve in the market, yes.
I can align around that too, right? And I hope that the behaviors that we see in organizations can be more embracing of that perspective.
That's the bigger hope, because it takes time to change habit and to change culture through behavior.
How about it? And you look at some of these bigger clients that we've been in service to for a lot of years now, and I start thinking back to my very first engagements. And it doesn't seem that long ago. And then when I do the math, it's been a long time. And it's cool to see how much change has taken place in that time. And it's also humbling to realize how much time it's taken. And it's really taken a complete turnover in leadership. Those people that we talked to 10 or 12 years ago that were, maybe engineers, maybe junior managers who are now in leadership roles, those messages stuck, and now they're in a position to really make those changes. It's an evolutionary change. I think the speed of business is requiring that it happens faster, but it doesn't happen overnight.
That's an interesting one to play with, the speed of innovation and some of the younger companies where people rise through levels in a matter of years, not decades.
Sure. And
partially I wonder, is that part of the speed of innovation? Like if I look at the executives, and you made me twitch a little bit when you talk about looking back, as I just realized this year marks my 20th year of playing with agility in one form or another. It's kind of crazy. But as I look back, the leadership are either retiring or moving into like C-level leadership roles now.
Sure.
And the early wave of playing with agility has authority now, not just influence.
But isn't that so cool? It's so cool. Yeah. You mentioned the tech native companies that work this way as a byproduct of having been startups, and they didn't have a choice, right? Mm-hmm. The social network was their lifeline. And then those patterns persisted. They didn't have this evolution through previous management structures and previous ways of thinking that they now have to unwind. They just kept that entrepreneurial spirit. So they get to grow up being who they are instead of trying to grow into something they now have to change out of. So there's a lot of interesting things there. So to pull us in a different direction, what else have you seen the last 2 days that's kind of cool?
I think one of the things that excites me most is I don't want to sound wrong, but a sense of maturity that I'm starting to experience. I was having a conversation last evening about the tone of the Agile community over the decades, I can say that now, and some of the just professionalism that I'm starting to see in the routine connection to purpose and business outcomes that in the past I think I've seen a lot of the, oh, that's not Agile, you're doing this wrong type mindset, as opposed to the, wow, this is a really hard situation. How can we apply some of these ideas to make it better?
I definitely agree with that. And I think with that maturity, some of the fodder in the broader ecosystem, right? It's never really been credible because the tone that some of those conversations have are just not ways that people who proclaim the empowerment of people and respect for people and culture should talk to one another. I think with that maturity, there's less of a tolerance for the disrespect among the community, right? We don't have to agree, and we won't. That's where innovation happens. That's where new ideas come from. But some of the toxicity, I think we're at a point now where we realize that our purpose is greater than our disagreements. And the common purpose is what's going to propel us all and our goals forward. And that wasting time on petty arguments is just time wasted that could have been better spent helping somebody else. I hope that's where we're going in this state of maturity, just in the space in general.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with your characterization. I don't know how deep we want to go into that.
Probably not very deep.
But I appreciate where you're saying. But bringing it back to the maturity I'm seeing, it's a sense of curiosity and empathy. And I'll say the best of the greater Agile community has inspired me with that for 15 years. And I could start rattling off all the amazing influencers that I've learned from over the years. But I'll tell you what, every single person on that influencer list is somebody that was building things up rather than tearing them down.
Absolutely. And again, it's not that we have to agree, right? If we're building towards a similar outcome, those conversations, those friction points spark new ideas in everybody involved in the conversation. And it's super cool to see how it's become less about capital A Agile and really more about how do we help achieve these outcomes, right? Agility is the mechanism. It's that cultural framework. It's that reference point. But I'm less concerned that you precisely prescribed to principle number 10 and more about how we're working together to achieve that thing with all of these guiding concepts and principles.
I think what you're saying is something that I've seen in SAFe since at least version 3 going back, is this idea that it's not about SAFe. It's not about Agile. It's not Agile for Agile's sake or SAFe for SAFe's sake or Scrum for Scrum's sake. It's how do we use a capability to improve the outcomes that we're seeking?
Sure.
And the more we hear people engage starting from that point, the better off the community will be, the better off our customers and clients and employers will be. And frankly, the better off we will be as humans, the more connected to our peers we'll feel.
Absolutely. And so I think to pull on your theme of maturity, I think the maturity that I see in the enterprise space is that we're not really seeing calls to come implement SAFe anymore, right? It's they understand that doing Agile for Agile's sake or SAFe for SAFe's sake, it's not getting anywhere, right? What's our reason? What are we trying to accomplish? What problem are we trying to solve? And there's more of a focus on how can you help us get here versus how do we do PI planning well, right? Mm-hmm. We understand that these things they can help us solve these issues that we have, but let's focus on those issues and how we trend towards those issues and how we know that we're getting better, as opposed to just, hey, come in and install the SAFe and then we're good.
Yeah, and I think kind of going full circle on this conversation a little bit, that's one of the things that excites me most about the focus on flow, is it makes the connections between the problems we see and the challenges and the impediments in the enterprise and shows that connection right back to the practices and why we choose to engage the portions of SAFe that we do. And everything we do, frankly, comes from a need to create flow. Like if it's not improving flow, we shouldn't be doing it. But a lot of that connection was assumed. It was if you do this train launch, if you build a good Scrum team, if you focus on having a clean prioritized backlog, you will see more flow. As opposed to, we need flow, here's the tools that help to achieve it. How do we accelerate this by applying this huge library of practices that we have available to us? And you can't do that if you don't come in with curiosity. And again, that's part of the maturity I see. I see a lot of leaders in the SAFe community coming forward and saying, not go launch a train, but instead saying, what are you struggling with? What's the impact it's having on your business? How can we help? And then starting to see how the tools in the library that we bring might support that.
So I want to ask you about one of the changes to the tools in the box, if you will, and kind of get your thoughts on it in terms of maturity. So there's been, for the first time in the framework, reference made to the idea of a coach, right? So at the team level, we now talk about the concept of a Scrum Master / team coach. Mm-hmm. How did that land with you, and how do you think it ties into that maturity of how we're working?
From a specific language point of view, it doesn't really concern me one way or the other. I've never been overly tied up on specifics of labels or what we call the things, except where it can create mass confusion. So calling a Scrum Master a coach is no different than we've expected Scrum Masters to behave since Scrum. They're supporting the team, they're challenging the team, they're helping the team become the best team they can through the toolkit they have at their disposal. So from that point of view, I think it just further clarifies the intent of some things that have probably been true for a very long time. And I can say the same of the release train engineer and the solution train engineer and the coaching leaders within the APMO or the VMO or whatever we choose to call that portfolio level coaching function. I'll also say that it provides a beautiful bridge into what we expect of leaders in general. For a long time, it's been a struggle for me to describe the Scrum Master role and the management role as fundamentally different things. While they have different things they're responsible for, all the characteristics of a great Agile manager, Agile leader, are pretty much great characteristics of a Scrum Master or an architect or a product manager or any other Agile leadership role for that matter. So I think we're just using the naming at this point to be much more clear on what's valuable and what's important. And that idea that there are people whose goal in their role should be to drive excellence in a humane, professional way. And we call that coaching.
I am adamantly aligned with you. My hope with this is by highlighting the skills and the intent of the role, we can start moving away from how the role's been commoditized. I think in the market, and right or wrong, people do things for a lot of different reasons. I feel as though the Scrum Master role has been commoditized and kind of pushed to being an administrator, right? Kind of like what we used to call a project coordinator. Mm-hmm. And that's never been the intent, right? But it's been get the metrics, run the meetings, send the meeting notes. And we've diluted the cost of that role. We've outsourced that role, and it's been marginalized. And that's to the detriment of all of the people who that role serves. And it's not that we put ill-intended people in that role, right? But we've put people in that role who are not best positioned to serve the team well. So we therefore don't get the results that we would expect. I remember my early Agile days, right? When you would talk about the role of a middle manager and, how they were completely removed from the team. They shouldn't do these things. I was humbled when I ran across a manager who was the team's Scrum Master. And at first I thought this is a horrible anti-pattern. My young Agile brain's going to explode. Fortunately, I was just barely mature enough to sit back and watch and listen before I ran my mouth. Because what I saw was something that was really beautiful. It was a person who embodied all of the characteristics of a Scrum Master and had enough trust that when it came time to do the people management stuff, would very physically take a step to the left. And he would say, all right, team, I need to take a step to the left now. And I need to speak to you as the administrator, the people manager, and not your Scrum Master. And the team trusted that person enough that they allowed that context switch to happen and then allowed them to seamlessly come back. And what I realized was it wasn't that this person was being a good manager or a good Scrum Master. It's that this person embodied what it meant to be a coach, a servant leader, and a trusted advisor to that team. And wouldn't it be cool if more people could perform that function with that level of trust well?
This being a podcast, people can't see that I literally have a little tear in my eye hearing that story. That's both incredible, and I think it's what I expect of leaders. And I'm unfortunately often disappointed at this. For a very long time, the value I've highlighted for Scrum Masters of, let's say, competent teams that have gotten to a certain level of being able to play on the field together and be successful. The value I have in the coach, in the Scrum Master at that level, is their network. It is their connections broadly across the enterprise where they can help the team connect where they need to connect without having to spend days or weeks tracking down people through 12 meetings and an escalation up to the C-level and back down to find the one person over an infrastructure that can solve their problem. The Scrum Master or the middle manager, I value deeply for those connections. They wouldn't be in the role if they weren't good at connecting broadly in the enterprise.
So I want to agree with you through a story, and I'm going to get a little fired up. So this event that you and I are attending right now, I'm not an event planner. I've never been an event planner. I don't want to do it again, right? There's almost 200 people here. There's a lot of moving parts. Wow, do I have respect for event planners.
And for context, he's kind of nailed it, and it's been an amazing experience, but I'll let him keep going.
Okay, so I'll thank you for that and then continue with my story because it wasn't me. The Scrum Master that my colleague and Joe and I have the privilege of working with, I mean, she's loaned out to us. We're a very small team. Her name's Madison. She is a remarkable human. And you can't see me, but I'm getting a little tear in my eye right now. For all of the reasons that you just said are the only reason this event came together. She had the ability to understand the things that were on my backlog that needed to be done and the relationships to go out there and help me solve those problems in the fastest, most expeditious manner with a smile on her face, but also that nudge that says, I am kind, I am here to serve you, but get it done. Like, she's amazing. And I think when you think of the value of that role, right, it's about being that force multiplier. This event wouldn't be what it is, and it wouldn't have been successful had she not been who she is. And I think when we look at how Scrum Masters are often treated in the market, right, and then you look at this contrasting example, when you have somebody with that capability, how could you ever say a team doesn't need somebody with that capability? It goes right back to the old Ian the Scrum Master video, right? You sit here and you do the things you're good at, and I'll help solve for the things that you need help for. And Madison was amazing with it, and I hope we never lose her, but I think she's definitely destined for things more important than helping Joe and I.
Yep. So I've also had the privilege of working with her for quite a while over the years and agree wholeheartedly. You talked about force multiplier in there, and I think that's a really, really powerful metaphor for the role that a Scrum Master should play in a team. I've heard many times from leaders the challenge well, why wouldn't I just hire one more dev? Wouldn't I get much more out of that than adding a Scrum Master to this team? And if they're talking about an average or a poor Scrum Master, I'll say a poor Scrum Master, they're absolutely right. Because 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, however many people you have on the team, equals 7. And a good Scrum Master isn't going to say +1 on a development side. But if they can say a times 1.2 or a times 1.3 because of the work that they do, then suddenly that is a multiplier. That is far more powerful than just adding another dev. And I saw this, I learned this lesson from a great leader when I was in my first consulting leadership role, software development, almost 20 years ago now. And there was a woman on my team that I took over the tech lead role for. And I'm like, well, she doesn't really seem to be doing much. She's talking to people a lot. She's wandering around. And I didn't really value her role on the team. I asked my leader at the time, and I won't name him because he'd probably blush a little bit. It's okay if she leaves the team. And he smiles. And he's like, yeah, you can do that. And productivity on the team and effectiveness just tanked. Within a week, it was clear nothing was happening. I'm look around. I'm nobody's talking to anybody. Oh, I see what I just did. And that leader had kindly kept her on the bench and available and was willing to spend that week as a lesson to me. And it was one of the most powerful lessons ever. It's when we talk about cross-functional teams, it's not about tester and dev and getting the certain ratio. It's having all of the skills necessary to deliver the goals we need to deliver. And one of those roles, one of those skills is the ability to connect broadly and understand how to get the right information and people in the right place so that things don't pause, so that we maintain flow. And I think those skills are overlooked. People call them soft or squishy or whatever. And it's like, oh, heck no. Those are hard and they take discipline and practice. And like, it's real work to maintain a relationship 4 divisions away by checking in every 6 weeks for a coffee meeting.
And I think the realization is those aren't skills that show up on a resume, right? You know, I would often coach people when they were building out their teams and hiring for the first time. You know, they would say, well, what skills do I need to put on the job description? You know, what technical skills do they need to have? And I would always say, you know, give me somebody 6 months out of school with the right personality, and I will give you an unbeatable Scrum Master. Mm-hmm. But you give me somebody with 20 years of skills and an inability to connect with people, and nothing that we do is going to make them effective in that role. And it's all about just, it's who you are. I mean, you can work hard to build those skills, but there's a special person that is well suited for that role. And when you have them, they are that force multiplier.
So I agree with the force multiplier. I do believe very strongly in a growth mindset. And you're right. For some people, I think that role is a challenge. Like, you'll probably feel like you're not doing anything half the time if you're like me and you value yourself based on output sometimes.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, Eric. It's hard.
Other times, I think it's like consulting days I've gone in, it's like, I didn't do anything but talk to people for 12 straight hours today. But I think I actually made the connections that are going to save millions of dollars, even though I didn't produce a single PowerPoint slide or a line of code. And it's all context.
Eric, I think we've got a bright few years ahead of us with this iteration of the framework. Like Dean often says, I'm pretty excited for Safe 8. You know, we keep getting better. Is there anything, any words of wisdom, because I know you've got a lot of them, that you would kind of like to leave folks with before we wrap this up?
I think so. It's probably not one anybody expects, but as you look at all the new stuff, be playful. Remember that sense of exploration and newness, and take a look at this with fresh eyes. We coach beginner's eyes, beginner's mind. See if you can bring that to what you're experiencing with the framework and surprise us with the innovation and how you use the new content. I get excited when I see what clients have done a couple of years later, because it's never what I expect, but it's usually beautiful. Because for us as consultants, for all the consultants out there, SPCs, leadership, and our clients, we have a remarkably intelligent, competent community that is using the stuff we're creating and publishing. And I think, I remember Dean saying this at least a decade ago at this point, all of them together are a heck of a lot smarter than any one of us.
Isn't that the truth?
So get out there, be curious, be playful, and share what you're learning.
And Eric, if they want to share that with you, where can they find you?
LinkedIn is probably the easiest. I love to have conversations. I love to hear from people. Drop me a line, Eric Willeke, and you'll see it in the show notes for the spelling and the link. And just tell me you heard the podcast, and I promise my first question will be, great, what did you learn?
I love it. Eric, thank you for making the time. I'll turn you loose back in open space. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Edo.
Thanks for listening to our show today. Be sure to check out the show notes and revisit past episodes at scaledagile.com/podcast. Relentless improvement is in our DNA, and we welcome your suggestions for the show. If you have something to share, send us an email at podcast@scaledagile.com.